The night the servers went down at Meridian Financial, 43 people were in that boardroom, and not one of them knew what to do. That was the part nobody talked about afterward. The part that got buried under the press releases and the carefully worded apologies and the LinkedIn posts about resilience and learning moments. 43 people with advanced degrees and six-figure salaries, standing around a conference table on the 32nd floor of a glass tower in downtown Toronto, watching the countdown clock on the wall tick towards zero. The IPO was scheduled for 9:47 the next morning. It was currently 11:22 at night, and the entire core banking system had been offline for 6 hours. Joel Carver found out the same way he found out most things that mattered, his daughter called him. He was in the garage of his house in Brampton, sitting on an overturned milk crate, drinking instant coffee that had gone cold about 20 minutes earlier. He had been sitting there since 8 o'clock after putting his daughter Sophie to bed, not because he had anything to do in the garage, just because sometimes a man needed 4 walls and a door he could close, and the garage was the only room in the house that was his. His phone buzzed, unknown number. He almost didn't answer. "Is this Joel Carver?" The voice on the other end was clipped, the kind of controlled voice that belonged to someone managing panic. Former senior systems architect at Meridian Financial. Joel set the mug down on the concrete floor. "Former is right. Mr. Carver, my name is Patricia Walsh. I'm the chief operating officer at Meridian. We have a situation." He knew. He'd been following the news on his laptop before he came out to the garage. The whole Bay Street community knew. Meridian's IPO was the biggest financial technology offering Canada had seen in a decade. $2 billion, institutional investors locked in from Vancouver to Halifax, a founding team that had appeared on the cover of Report on Business 3 times in the last 2 years. And sometime around 5:30 that afternoon, something had gone very wrong in the guts of the system. The outage had made the news by 7. By 9, it was the lead story. "I heard," Joel said. There was a pause. He could hear voices in the background, the particular low hum of a room full of frightened people trying to sound calm. "We have a team of 40 systems engineers on site," Patricia Walsh said. "We've brought in 2 external consulting firms. We've been working for 6 hours and we cannot isolate the fault." Joel picked up the mug again, set it back down. "You fired me 14 months ago," he said. "The severance agreement had a non-disparagement clause. I signed it. You also had me walked out of the building by security. In front of my whole team." Another pause, longer this time. "I know that too," she said. "Joel, Mr. Carver, I'm not going to pretend that what happened was handled well. What I can tell you is that right now, in 9 hours and 22 minutes, Meridian Financial is going to open on the TSX for the first time. And if our system is still down, we're not talking about a bad day. We're talking about the kind of thing that ruins companies. Permanently." Joel looked at the water stain on the garage ceiling. Somebody had told him it was a slow leak from the bathroom above it. He kept meaning to fix it. "I have a daughter," he said. "She's 7. School starts at 8:15. I'll have a car there in 20 minutes. He thought about Sophie upstairs, asleep with one arm around the stuffed rabbit she'd had since she was 2. He thought about his neighbor, Mrs. Fontaine, who was 71 and kept a spare key and had told him more than once that he worked too hard and never asked for enough help. He thought about the 6 months he'd spent after the firing sending out resumes and getting form rejections, and the part-time contract work that paid half of what he used to make, and the look on Sophie's face the morning he'd explained to her, as gently as a man could, that they probably couldn't afford the hockey camp she'd been talking about since February. He thought about the system, the one he'd spent 3 years building from the ground up. "Send the car," he said. What happened 14 months ago was simple. The way most betrayals are simple when you strip them down to the facts. Joel had spent 32 months as senior systems architect at Meridian, which meant he was the person who designed the fault tolerance framework at the core of their banking infrastructure. Not the code itself, that was a team effort and he'd been the first to say so, but the architecture, the logic underneath the code, the framework that was supposed to make a failure like tonight's impossible. He had documented a critical vulnerability in that framework in month 29. A gap in the redundancy protocols, specific to high-volume transaction events, exactly the kind of load that an IPO listing would generate. He had written it up in a 17-page technical report, flagged it as urgent, and submitted it to his direct manager, a man named Stanton Price. Stanton Price had been at Meridian for 11 years. He was the kind of man who forwarded emails without reading them, and took credit for other people's work without thinking of it as taking credit. He thought of it as management. What Joel found out 3 weeks later through a chain of forwarded messages that landed in his inbox by accident was that Stanton had presented Joel's vulnerability report to the executive team as his own discovery, his own analysis, his own solution. Joel had made the mistake of pointing this out, formally, in writing. 2 weeks after that, he was called into HR and informed that his position had been eliminated in a restructuring. They'd handed him a box for his desk items and waited while he packed it. Security had accompanied him to the elevator. Joel was 41 years old, a single father, and had just been fired for doing his job too well. The irony of it could have been funny. In a different life, the car was a black SUV. The driver didn't make conversation, which Joel appreciated. He sat in the back and looked out at the 401, quiet at this hour, the lights of the city sliding past in orange and white streaks, and he thought about the vulnerability report. He had a copy. He'd always had a copy. He'd kept it on a personal encrypted drive that he'd updated every time he revised the document, which had been 11 times over 6 months. Habit. Or maybe, somewhere in the back of his mind, something that knew it might matter someday. He hadn't brought the drive tonight. He hadn't needed to. He remembered every word. The lobby of Meridian's head office was the kind of space designed to make you feel the weight of money, all glass and steel and polished concrete, with a corporate logo backlit in blue on the far wall. At nearly midnight, it felt like a museum that had been broken into. There were people everywhere, engineers in jeans and hoodies, executives in crumpled dress shirts, a woman in a blazer talking rapidly into a phone near the security desk. A tall man in his 50s came through the turnstiles and extended his hand. He had the look of someone who'd been awake for 19 hours and was running on stubbornness. "Joel, Grant Hartley, I'm the CTO." Joel shook his hand. "I know who you are." Grant Hartley gave him a look that was somewhere between embarrassed and relieved. "Whatever happened before, let's just fix the system," Joel said. They took the elevator to 32. The boardroom had been converted into a war room. There were laptops open on every surface, 3 separate screens showing system dashboards, and a whiteboard covered in diagrams that someone had been adding to and crossing out all evening. The smell of cold pizza and stale coffee hung in the air. People looked up when Joel walked in. A few of them he recognized. A few of them looked away. He saw Stanton Price standing near the window. Stanton had not changed in 14 months. He was still the same medium-sized, medium-built man with the particular quality of seeming important without ever being specific about why. He was holding a printout and wearing the expression of a man who had run out of ideas 3 hours ago but hadn't told anyone yet. He looked at Joel. His face went very still. Joel looked at him for exactly 2 seconds, then looked away. Patricia Walsh crossed the room. She was smaller than he'd expected from her voice, compact, direct, with the kind of eyes that didn't offer apology but acknowledged reality. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Show me the logs," Joel said. He sat down at a terminal in the corner. Someone brought him a coffee he didn't ask for and set it beside the keyboard. He ignored it. The room was quiet. That was the thing nobody talked about afterward either, how quiet it got. 40 people in a room, and within about 4 minutes of Joel sitting down, the conversations tapered off and the movements stilled, and people just watched. Not because they knew he would find it. Because they had been at it for 6 hours and had nothing left. And there was something in the way he moved through the system, the speed of it, the certainty, no hesitation, no dead ends, that made the room hold its breath. Joel Carver moved through the logs the way a man moves through a house he built himself. He knew where everything was. He knew what it was supposed to look like, and he could see immediately where it didn't. The fault was in the redundancy handoff layer, exactly where he'd said it would be in a report he'd written 20 months ago. A gap in the protocol that only opened under sustained high-volume transaction load, the kind of load you'd see, for instance, if a company with $2 billion in committed investment went live on a public exchange. It had taken the external consultants 6 hours to not find this. It took Joel 11 minutes. He sat back. "It's the redundancy handoff in the Tier 2 failover," he said. There was no drama in his voice, just the flat fact of it. There's a timing gap in the sequencing that causes the system to enter a wait state when transaction volume exceeds the load threshold. It never triggers under normal conditions. It's been there since the framework was built. He paused. Since the framework was designed. The room was silent. "How long to fix it?" Patricia Walsh asked. "I have to write a patch and run it through a sandboxed environment first. 2 hours, maybe less." Someone in the back of the room exhaled audibly. "What caused it?" Grant Hartley asked. Joel's eyes moved briefly to Stanton Price, who had not moved from his position near the window. "It was documented," Joel said. "In a report submitted to management 20 months ago. The vulnerability was identified, described, and a solution was outlined. The patch was never implemented. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence." Grant Hartley turned slowly. Everyone in the room did the same thing, the way you can't help turning when you feel the gravity shift. Stanton Price's face had gone the color of old wax. He began. "Not now," Patricia Walsh said very quietly. She was still looking at Joel. "Not now, Stanton." Joel wrote the patch in the corner of the room, alone, the way he'd always worked best. The room hadn't exactly emptied. People had jobs to do and terminals to monitor. But the energy had changed. The panic had been replaced by something more focused. People were doing things again instead of just staring at screens. At 2:47 in the morning, he ran the patch in the sandbox, clean. At 3:18, with Grant Hartley and Patricia Walsh standing behind him and half the room watching the dashboards, he pushed it to production. The system came online in 4 seconds. Nobody cheered. That surprised Joel a little. But then he thought about it, and it made sense. Cheering felt wrong when you understood what had actually happened here, what had almost happened. Patricia Walsh put her hand briefly on his shoulder, just for a moment. Then she turned back to her team and started giving instructions, and the room came alive again with the particular energy of people who have been given back something they thought they'd lost. Joel sat in the corner and finished the cold coffee someone had left beside him. It was terrible. He thought about Sophie, asleep in her room in Brampton. He thought about the stuffed rabbit. He thought about the hockey camp. He was waiting for the elevator when Stanton Price found him. It was almost 4 in the morning. The hallway was empty, the kind of emptiness that only exists in office buildings in the small hours, all fluorescent hum and carpet and nothing. Stanton had lost the printout. His hands were empty now and they moved awkwardly, the way hands do when they don't have anything to hold. "Joel," he said. Joel pressed the elevator button. "It wasn't personal," Stanton said. "Back then, you have to understand the timing, the restructuring." "I understand fine," Joel said. "What are you going to do?" The elevator arrived. Joel stepped in and turned around. He looked at Stanton Price across the gap between them, this man who had taken his work and put his name on it, who had fired him for objecting, who had stood in this same building 6 hours ago holding a printout and watching everything fall apart and not had a single useful thing to say. "I'm going to go home," Joel said. "My daughter wakes up at 7. The door's closed." He didn't go straight home. He sat in the back of the car on the way to Brampton and let himself feel the full weight of the night. Not just the last 6 hours, the whole 14 months, the box of desk items, the security escort, the 6 months of rejection emails, the hockey camp conversation. He didn't feel triumphant. That was the thing. People might assume he would. In stories, the person who's been wronged feels something electric when they're proven right, something clarifying, some bright and satisfying reversal. What Joel felt mostly was tired and quietly certain of something he'd known for a while, that he was good at what he did, that he had always been good at what he did, that the firing hadn't changed that, and the 14 months hadn't changed that, and the 40 engineers in that boardroom who hadn't found what he found in 11 minutes hadn't changed that either. He was good at this. He had always been good at this, and the record would show it now. That was enough. Patricia Walsh called him at 9 the next morning while he was making Sophie's lunch before school. "The IPO opened at 9:47, she said. "We're up 14%. "Good," Joel said. There was a pause. Through the phone, he heard the ambient noise of a very different boardroom than the one from the night before. Voices, energy, something that sounded almost like celebration. "We're going to need to have a longer conversation," Patricia Walsh said. "About a lot of things, including what your situation looks like going forward, if you're open to it." Joel was spreading peanut butter on whole wheat bread. Sophie was at the kitchen table behind him, working on a drawing of a horse that she had been working on in various forms for about 3 weeks. "I'm open to a conversation," he said. "And Stanton Price situation, a beat. You should know the board has asked for a full review of the circumstances around your departure, the technical report, the timeline, all of it. What happened to that report, the way your work was presented, that's not something the company can let stand." Joel looked out the kitchen window. The neighborhood was quiet in the morning light, the maple tree in the front yard starting to show the first faint green of new leaves. "I still have my copy," he said. "Original version, time-stamped, every revision." He could hear her exhale. "I had a feeling you might," she said. "Who took 3 months." Joel cooperated fully, provided every document he had, and said nothing publicly. He had never said anything publicly. It wasn't in him to perform the vindication, to post about it, or talk about it, or turn it into the kind of story people tell about themselves at networking events. What he knew was this: the work had always been his, the report was always his. The system worked because of his architecture, and when it had failed in the one specific way he had predicted and documented and warned against, he had fixed it in 11 minutes. That was the whole story, really. Everything else was just the noise around it. Stanton Price resigned before the review concluded. The announcement was terse and brief and made no specific mention of why, but people in that industry talk, and within a week the shape of what had happened was understood by everyone who needed to understand it. The formal letter from Meridian came in late September. It acknowledged the circumstances of his dismissal, confirmed that his severance had been insufficient given the findings of the review, and offered him a settlement that he reviewed with a lawyer in Mississauga, who had a no-nonsense approach and a framed photo of the 2019 Raptors championship behind her desk. It was more than he'd expected. He called his mother in Sperry to tell her, which led to a 40-minute conversation that he didn't mind at all. The job offer came separately, a week after the settlement. Grant Hartley called him directly, not Patricia Walsh this time, the CTO himself, and offered him a senior advisory role, working remotely with flexible hours, structuring the next phase of the system's overhaul. Joel told him he'd think about it. He thought about it for 4 days. He went for long walks around the neighborhood. He drank coffee on the back steps while Sophie played in the yard. He drove out to Guelph on a Saturday with no specific purpose, just to move, just to think. He said yes. Not because he had forgiven everything. That was its own longer process, and he was honest with himself about where he was on it. He said yes because the work was interesting, and he was good at it, and because a flexible remote contract meant he could be home in the morning when Sophie left for school, and home again when she came back. Because at the end of everything, the layoff, the months of uncertainty, the midnight call, the 11 minutes in the corner of a boardroom, at the end of all of it, the thing that had held steady was simple. He was her father, he showed up, that was the job. The following spring, Sophie started hockey camp. She called him from the rink on the first day, voice high and bright and breathless, telling him about the skating drills and a girl named Petra she'd met and the hot chocolate they'd had at the break. And he sat in his home office in Brampton and listened to every single word. Outside the window, the maple tree was fully green. Inside the house, the water stain on the garage ceiling was gone. He'd fixed it himself on a Sunday afternoon in November, which had taken about 40 minutes and one trip to the hardware store on Queen Street. Some things, when you finally get to them, turn out to be simpler than you expected.